Welcome to The Soul Truth with Pauline Montemayor, the podcast where we dive deep into the worlds of healing and the truths about spirituality, mental health, and the soul. This podcast is for the real ones, the ones who have the courage to dig deep, the ones who are longing to heal and willing to do the work, and the ones who are ready to embrace and fully stand in their own truth and get to know who they truly are deep within the soul. I'm your host, Pauline, here to guide you towards your own soul truth and cultivating a life of authenticity and alignment. So let's get into it. Welcome back to The Soul Truth with Pauline Montemayor. On this episode, I'll be sharing about the realness and sacredness of dark times in life and how it contributes to your own light and soul truth. When I was formulating this episode, I had a little bit of a hard time because I knew that it was going to be relevant for me to talk more about grief and loss. But at first I was like, oh man, that's a really heavy topic. And I don't want to seem like a Debbie Downer on my podcast. But the more I thought about it and the more I prayed and meditated on it, I realized that it's actually really important for me to talk about this because we don't talk about these things enough. If you look at today's world, today's society, everyone wants to show off all the good moments in life. And yes, those are important. But look at social media. It's nothing but highlights of all the good moments of people's lives. But the reality is, everyone goes through dark and hard times in life. No one is exempt from it. It doesn't matter how spiritual you are, how evolved you are, how powerful or wealthy you are. Everyone experiences hardship and loss and goes through dark times in life. So this episode is going to be very real because it needs to be. It's important for me to be honest with all of you about my hard times and my real times in life, but also for you all to understand that what I'm going to be discussing is part of everybody's life. And this is why I said that this podcast is for the real ones, because I'm not going to be giving you guys fake information. What I'm going to be giving you guys is the honest, real truth, the soul truth, because you cannot have the soul truth without realness and honesty. So the reality is we all experience loss in life. In fact, we may have multiple losses in our life. And I'm not just referring to the loss of a loved one through death. I'm also talking about the loss of a relationship or friendship, the loss of a job, the loss of a home, the loss of material things. The reality is we all experience different kinds of losses throughout our life. But with loss also comes grief. And the hard reality is that grief is a part of life. We will all grieve something or someone at some point in life if you have not already. It is inevitable. And who likes grief? I definitely don't, and I don't think anyone else does. But I think it's about learning to accept that loss and grief is going to be part of your life. It's going to be part of your human experience. And it's also going to be part of your soul experience. But there's a lot of value in it, and I think that a lot of people tend to ignore or not even see the value in it because it's so hard and it's so painful. But I think it's important to start looking at these things through a different lens so that you can understand that there is something much deeper and more valuable within it for you and for your soul. I've experienced many different kinds of losses throughout my life, whether that be through people passing away, breakups, material things. I've had all different kinds of losses in my life. And, as I mentioned in my last episode, the grief for my dad started when he was in the hospital because I was slowly losing my father throughout his hospitalization. I was slowly watching him die and fade away right before my eyes. But after my father passed away, there is nothing or anything that could have prepared me for the weight of that loss and the heaviness of the grief that I felt after he passed. The thing is, I knew in my mind that this loss was going to be hard, but I had no idea how intense it was going to be. I mean, there were days where this grief felt like unbearable. It was just so heavy and so sad. And it was like this thing that I constantly kept feeling that just wouldn't go away. I definitely was depressed after my father passed away. And I laugh because I'm a therapist and I know exactly what symptoms of depression look like and are. And I definitely had some of those symptoms. So I know for sure I was depressed and I felt it. I definitely felt it. And I think one of the hardest parts about my grief was that I just didn't feel like myself. Like, no matter what I did, no matter how much normalcy I tried to maintain in my life, I could feel that something was still missing. And I could feel that I just was not 100% myself. And as time passed on, that became very scary to me because I was like, yo, is this the new normal? Like, am I always going to feel this way? Am I never going to feel like myself again? Is this the new me? And that was terrifying to me because I didn't like the way that I felt and I knew that I wasn't 100% myself. And the idea of that becoming my new reality was scary. And the thing is, like I mentioned, I've experienced loss before. You know, even in terms of death, I've had other family members pass away that I was also very close to, and those passings absolutely impacted me. But this was completely different, you know, and understandably so because it's my dad. You know, it's a very different relationship. But when I tell you, I felt this loss in every part of my being. Like I felt it in the depths of me. It was just so deep. And it was unlike any other grief, you know, or pain or sadness that I had felt before. And like I said, there was nothing that could prepare me for it. And I think the hard part is I was trying to figure out how to move through it and navigate through it as it was happening. You know, there was nothing to really guide me or any previous example that I had that could help me to move through this grief because it was so new to me. It was so deep to me. And it was so different than anything I had experienced before. When you think about grief, right, and when you think about loss, there is nothing pretty or easy about it at all. I always say, especially to my therapy clients, that grief is one of the most complex and complicated things that a person will ever experience and feel. And you just never know sometimes how it's going to hit you or how it's going to affect you. You know, I always say that grief comes in waves. There's days where it might be like a little baby wave and you might, you know, cry a little bit and move past it. And then there's days where it's like a tsunami. It's like this giant wave of sadness and pain that just overwhelms you and takes over you. And this is why it is so complicated because you don't always know how it's going to come at you. And the thing is, all you can do is ride that wave. All you can do is ride through that moment of grief until it eventually passes. And that's hard. It doesn't feel good and it's very uncomfortable and it can be very painful. But the reality is, that's the only way through it is to ride it out. This time in my life was not only painful, but it was very difficult for me. And I struggled. I really struggled with my grief, and it was very difficult for me to even talk about it with anybody. You know, I don't know if some of you guys can relate to this, but I've always been the type of person to handle things alone. I'm the type that, like, if I'm going through something, I take time away by myself to try to process it and analyze it and work through it first in my own mind before I really start talking to other people about it. And that was no different from my grief. The reality is, I grieved a lot by myself. Even though my family was going through the same loss that I was and was grieving too, the reality is we all grieved very differently, because we all had our own ways of coping with it. We also had our own relationship and dynamic and bond with my dad, that was very different. So we were all impacted in different ways. Therefore, we were all grieving and coping in different ways. But, you know, a lot of people during that time may have seen me and I may have looked okay from the outside, but I may not have really shown or talked about the emptiness that I was feeling inside. No one really saw when I was breaking down at home. No one saw when I was ugly crying in my bed. No one saw the days that I would be so sad and would be struggling to get out of my bed and go about my daily life. No one saw those hard moments. And I shielded that from people because to me, this grief was a private matter, but it was also sacred in its own ways, right? And that's why I was protective of it. So even though I chose to handle a lot of my grief in private, the point is, and I think this is important to mention, that I made sure that I was still allowing myself to have the space and time to feel and process my emotions and my grief. So I would have those days and moments when I would allow myself to cry. I'd allow myself to have ugly cries. I would allow myself to feel the heaviness, to feel the sadness, to feel the weight of it. I recognize that a lot of people often may avoid these kinds of moments because they don't want to feel those things, but it's actually really important to give yourself the space and time to feel and process those feelings and that grief. And on top of that, I still made sure that I was still maintaining daily routines, and self-care practices. Like, this is where I think my therapist brain really kicked in because I basically had to do everything that I've always told my clients to do. I always tell them, use your coping skills, make sure you're doing self-care, make sure you're having balance in your life. So I made a point to still maintain my routines. I was still going to work every day. I was still going to the boxing gym all the time. I was still trying to maintain a sense of normalcy so that I wouldn't go too off the rails. So between keeping up with my routines and my practices of self-care and then having my private moments of grief and processing is a lot of what helped me to really feel and cope with and process my emotions and my grief. The reality is we have to sit through and move through those feelings. We have to allow those emotions and that energy to move through and move out of our body. You can't release it without having these kinds of ugly, uncomfortable moments. These moments are really important to the grieving process because it's allowing the emotions to move. A lot of people avoid these moments because they don't want to feel these things. And the way to lighten the load or the heaviness of the grief is to actually have these kinds of moments where you can slowly start to release them from your heart, from your soul, and from your body. It's important and it's needed. And the important thing is to really allow yourself to experience these things and to lean into these kinds of moments because that's what's actually going to create more space for healing and for peace. Grief can really feel very lonely and very isolating. When you think about any time in your life where you've had a loss, and I'm not just speaking about someone passing away, think about the time you've gone through a breakup, or you lost a job, or you lost something that was really important to you. Can you remember how alone you may have felt during that time, or how isolated you may have felt compared to everybody else around you? And sometimes we may even create our loneliness because we may withdraw and pull back from being around other people or talking about our losses because it's hard and it's painful. And sometimes we don't want to talk about or share about those things with others. But the reality is, at some point in life, actually, in multiple points of life, we will all mourn someone or something. And those periods of mourning are going to be rough. And like I said, they can feel lonely and they can feel isolating and they definitely can be difficult and painful. I think one of the hardest things for me during my grief process was seeing everybody else's life move on. You know, in those first couple years after my father passed away, some of my closest people, my closest friends, had these beautiful, amazing life milestones happening. I'm talking about they got engaged, they got married, they had a baby, they bought their dream home, like these monumental, like peak life moments. And don't get me wrong, I was so happy for my friends. I love my people and I want to see them win. And of course, I was happy for them. But there was a part of me that struggled because I was like, damn, everybody out here moving on, having these beautiful moments. And I'm literally here trying to pick up the pieces. I'm trying to put not only myself back together, I'm trying to put my life back together because I'm now trying to figure out what is even my life like now without my dad? How am I supposed to live and move on without one of the most important people in my life? And how do I even now find myself in all of this? Think about the times when you've lost a loved one or when you've gone through a breakup. You know, it's just questions of like, who am I now without this person or without this relationship, right? Or like when you lose a job, who am I without this role, without this title? We all have moments in life where our identity is going to be completely shaken up. We're going to have to sit there and figure out who am I now without this, without whatever it is that you lost. You know, and those identity shaking moments come in these dark and hard times. And that's part of what I think makes it so difficult is because you start to question who you are. You got to find yourself and figure out yourself all over again. And that experience can feel daunting. That process can feel and look very scary and challenging, and it is. But I also think that these moments happen because it gives us opportunity to redefine ourselves. It allows us to now discover something new about us, right? Or to create a new and better version of ourselves. And there's beauty in that. So I think it's important to understand that as much as we may get shaken up by these situations and experiences we go through a loss, there is opportunity here to create and discover who we actually really are now without those people or those things. We have to figure out who we are now beyond the loss. So here comes one of the realest parts of this episode. With loss, or even with grief, often comes avoidance. Now, let's be for real for a second. Most people, when they experience something hard or painful, or when they're going through a loss or a grieving period, whatever it may be, they typically want to avoid what they're feeling, what they're dealing with, whatever's in front of them. And for obvious reasons, right? Because these moments are painful, they are uncomfortable, they don't feel good, you know, and they can bring up a lot of different emotions that people just don't want to feel and people don't want to deal with. So a lot of people avoid these moments in their life. They be running from it like the plague. It's that hard and it's that uncomfortable. And the reality is, we are all guilty of it, myself included. I'm not even going to sit here and act like I've never avoided a hard time or hard feelings in my life. I 100% have done so. In fact, it's actually crazy that I'm talking about all of this so openly now with all of you, because there was a time in my life where I could not even speak about this at all. I've been in therapy for the past 10 years consistently, and I was in therapy before everything happened with my dad, during, and after, and I'm still in therapy to this day. And I remember after my father passed away, I went to see my therapist and I straight up told her, I'm not ready to talk about what happened. And as a whole therapist, I know how important it is to talk about and process things in session, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And my therapist, shout out to her, she respected where I was at and she honored that and she didn't push me, and it took a few months before I could even start to slowly open up and talk about my grief and what I was feeling. And the reality is I didn't want to talk about it because I knew if I started speaking about it in session, it was going to be real. And I would then have to start feeling and facing and dealing with all these emotions that I just didn't want to. So I would go to therapy and talk about all these other things going on in my life, except for the biggest thing that I was dealing with, which was my grief. And that's just one example of how I avoided it. On top of that, I've always been somebody that's journaled. I journaled my whole life, like since I was a kid. I remember being like 7 or 8 years old, and I had those little diaries, the ones with the little locks on the side, and you had the little key to like open it up. Like I had those kind of diaries as a kid. I used to hide them in a pouch and hide them in the back of my closet so that no one would find it. But I've been writing about my life forever. And journaling has always been very helpful for me and very therapeutic for me because it's always helped me to release my emotions and it would give me a lot of more insight and help me to better process things that I was going through. And when my father passed away, I could not even touch, let alone open my journal for months. I avoided my journal. I don't even think I took it out of the drawer because I knew if I started writing in this journal, it was going to become very real for me. I was going to have to start facing and writing about and feeling my feelings. And I didn't want to do it because it was that painful and it was that heavy. So I understand firsthand that avoidance is real. And I get why we all do it because at the time, it feels like the easier thing to do. But the reality is this: whatever you avoid is not going to go away. It's not going to magically disappear. It's not going to fade into the abyss. And it's not going to solve itself. The only way that you can actually overcome and really heal from this type of pain and experience is by actually going through it and allowing yourself to go through it. Like they say, the only way out is through. So avoiding is not going to do that for you. At some point, you do have to face whatever that thing is, and you got to face it head on. And that time for me came. So, a little over a year after my father passed away, I finally decided to go to grief group therapy. And I had attended actually a number of sessions. And going to that group was extremely helpful and healing to me because number one, I saw that there were other people who were feeling and going through the same exact things as me. So I really felt less alone, and don't get me wrong, I've been blessed with an amazing support system in my life. I have wonderful family and friends around me, but it was really difficult to talk sometimes about my grief to the people around me because I knew some of them had not experienced that type of loss yet, or are going through very different things in their life. So I felt like not everyone could really get me, right, and understand what I was feeling and dealing with in real time. But going to, grief group therapy really validated me, and it gave me a safe space where I could finally start opening up and openly talking about what I actually went through and how I was actually feeling through everything that happened with my father and after. And that's the beauty about group therapy. It gives people the opportunity to really connect. You connect through your feelings, you connect through your experiences, you cultivate empathy and validation for each other. And as a therapist, I've run many group therapy sessions in my career, and I've seen the power of group happen right before my eyes. But to now experience it for myself firsthand on the other side was really powerful for me. I'm like, yo, this works. But it does. And it helped a lot in me really being able to start healing the wounds of my father's passing and my grief. So, moral of the story is when I started to actually face my feelings and start talking about the deeper parts of my grief through group therapy, that is when more healing and more peace started to come into my life. Because at this point now, I was no longer avoiding certain parts of my grief that I had avoided for the whole first year after he passed away. There were certain memories and certain experiences that I had gone through that I literally could not talk about for that entire first year. To be all the way real, my father's hospitalization was very traumatic for me. Seeing my dad like that in such a vulnerable, critical, ill state was heartbreaking. There's still images and memories that I cannot get out of my head. I still get triggered when I hear certain medical machines and beeping sounds because it takes me right back to the hospital room and hearing those machines at all hours of the day and seeing my dad hooked up to all these different machines and all these cords and wires everywhere. And as painful as those experiences are, I've also learned to accept that they will always be there and that it's something that I have been learning to live with and manage. But that group therapy session, those sessions were the first time that I was actually able to openly discuss those memories and those experiences and how traumatizing they were for me and everything after. By me now facing it and talking about it and putting it out there, that's what allowed me to start moving forward. Because, like I said, you cannot heal what you avoid. And yo, I have seen people literally avoid themselves to avoid whatever it is that they got going on. Like people be avoiding that hard that they avoid themselves in order to avoid their problems and their issues and their pain. But it's not going to go away until you face it and address it and overcome it. That's where the healing starts. That's where it begins. When you open up about it and you face it and you talk about it and you look at it in real time, that is where your healing really starts to bloom. The reality is that grief does not go away. It does not disappear. It doesn't vanish into thin air. We cannot erase it. When you think about the losses that you may have experienced in your life, the reality is you just eventually learn how to live with and manage those losses. You learn how to live without those people or those things. And eventually your life began to move forward. So we can't erase the pain. We can't make it go away, but we learn how to live with it. We learn how to manage it in a way that it becomes less intense and less overwhelming. And that's the healing part of it. We just learn how to live with it. And the reality is, with grief especially, you still may have those moments when you might shed a thug tear, or boo-hoo cry. But that's always going to be a part of it, and I've learned to accept that, especially with the loss of my father, that I'm going to probably have these kinds of grieving moments for the rest of my life. It definitely has gotten easier in the sense of it not being as intense and as overwhelming as often as it used to be after he first passed away. But these moments still happen. There's times where I may see something or hear something that reminds me of my dad, and I cry and I get sad and I feel all those things all over again. But I've accepted that that's going to be a part of my life. And I think the more that we're able to accept that rather than resist it, we come to more peace with it. Now, here comes the second realist part of this conversation. The reality is, when you are on the spiritual path, it is going to require you to go through these hard and dark times. Like I said earlier, people try to avoid these hard moments and life moments at all costs, but you can't avoid it. We all have to go through them. Like I said, nobody is exempt from this. We all have to go through them. The thing is, the spiritual path is not going to always be love and lights and rainbows and butterflies. No, the spiritual path, yes, it does have those things, but it also has these dark, painful, and trying times. These difficult times are also part of the path. A lot of people turn to religion and spirituality because they want to feel better. They're searching for something that's going to help them to feel better and pull them out of whatever darkness they're feeling. And yes, religion, faith, spirituality, it can do that for you. However, it's not going to make whatever painful or dark thing you got going on go away. And that is where a lot of people trip up. Okay, there's a term called spiritual bypassing, which is when people overly rely on their religious or spiritual beliefs and practices to make them feel better. And they now are only focusing on that, and they're not actually addressing the problems and issues that are there. So they're basically bypassing their issues and dark times and hardships through their spirituality. And like I said, when you do that, whatever you got going on that you're not facing, it's gonna eventually pop up. And this is eventually where people are like, oh, I was doing XYZ to help myself. I was doing all these spiritual practices, rituals, prayers, novenas, etc., and nothing is helping me. Well, the bigger question is, are you helping yourself by facing what's hurting you? Because those things can help you, but it's not going to do all that it can do if you yourself are not doing the work to get through these hard, dark times. Real spirituality is facing yourself. It's facing all the parts of you that you want to run away from or ignore or hide. It's learning how to sit in the discomfort of yourself, your pain, your emotions. And it's learning how to get comfortable with the uncomfortable, because trust me, it's gonna get uncomfortable. There are growing pains in this. It can definitely be painful at times, and it's gonna bring up things that you don't wanna feel. But that is where real spiritual growth happens. It doesn't happen in the love and light, kumbaya moments all the time. That's part of it. But the real growth is here. It's in these dark times, these hard times. And that is why they are sacred, okay? Because they possess deeper things within them that are going to help you grow and elevate your life. I follow a lot of spiritual content on social media, and I've seen a whole bunch of different creators, quote unquote teachers, whatever you want to call them. And a lot of people out here are only talking about love and light. Okay, they're glamorizing spirituality and basically trying to just sell you all the good parts of it to try to help you feel better. They're not talking about this stuff. They're not talking about the actual hard truths and reality about spirituality that is going to cause you to have to face your pain, work through your emotions, overcome your hardships. And this is why discernment is important in who you're following and who you're listening to, especially on a spiritual level, because some of them are only selling you a dream. They're not selling you the reality. They're not telling you the reality, matter of fact. They're just telling you what you want to hear so that you can feel good and subscribe to whatever they got going on. And, spirituality is beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful things in life, in my opinion. But it's not just that. It comes with challenges and hardship and these painful moments that I've been talking about this entire episode. And that is the real truth about it. And just to give you guys a quick example, all right, let's look at Jesus Christ. Now, whether or not you are a follower or believer of Jesus Christ is not really relevant to this conversation right now. I'm just merely using an example from his life here on earth. Jesus is considered one of the highest spiritual teachers of all time, okay? And there are others, but I'm just referencing Jesus right now. When you look at Jesus's life, ain't nothing about it was glamorous. Nothing. He lived a very simple life that was filled with hardship and adversity, especially in his years of ministry. No, this man had people coming for him all the time, people plotting on his downfall. His hardship and adversity went all the way to the point of his own death. That's how hard it was. And when people think about Jesus, they honor and revere him for his death and his sacrifice and all the good works that he did throughout his life. But it wasn't just that. When you really look at how he lived his life here as a human on earth, it was filled with hardship and pain and difficulty. But he did all the good that he was doing, even while all these dark, hard things were happening in his life. So he's an example in real time how you have to work through hardship and pain and challenges to be on the spiritual path. He was on one of the biggest spiritual paths of all time, and he was not exempt from hardship and pain or grief. All of that was a part of his path. So this is why I say it's important to remember that for all of us, whether you've been on the spiritual path or you're just taking your first steps, the real truth is that this is all going to be a part of your path. There is no escaping it. What's important is about learning how to understand the value of your hardship and learning how to understand the value and the lessons of pain and loss, because those things are actually some of the greatest teachers that we will ever have in our lives. Real spiritual work, real soul work, is you facing your darkness and learning how to navigate through it. And that work is what's going to lead you to your soul truth. And the thing is, the soul truth is not just one big discovery. We have multiple discoveries of our soul truth throughout our life. You've probably already had soul truth moments and discoveries already, right? And this is about learning how to discover even more of that if you haven't already. Like, I've had other soul truth moments, but I have to say that the soul truth moment I had after my father's passing, or even going through that, was one of the biggest soul truth moments and discoveries that I've ever had. But it also came with the biggest loss and the deepest pain that I've ever felt. The reality is, before you can come into your light, you have to learn how to understand your own darkness. You have to know, what does this darkness look like? What does it feel like? Where does it live inside of me? Where does it show up in my life? Because in order to heal it, you have to know it first. And the more that you know it, the less afraid you become of it, right? Because a lot of times people avoid it because they're afraid of it. But the more you actually get to know that darkness or that pain or those hardships in your life, the more you're going to understand it. And the less afraid you become of facing it and conquering it. As I mentioned in my first couple episodes, I like to look at life through a soul lens. Now, the reality is when we go through these dark and hard times, our soul lenses may not be very clear. When you think about when you go into a dark room, it takes a few minutes for your eyes to be able to adjust to the darkness and to be able to actually see where things are. And then once you see them, you're able to start moving through that room, right? The same is with our soul lens, with our spiritual eyes. When we're going through a dark time, we may not always know right away how to move through it. We may not always know what's even in front of us. But when you give yourself that minute to adjust and give your eyes, your spiritual eyes, a moment to adjust, then you're going to be able to start seeing what's actually in front of you. And you're going to be able to start to figure out how to now walk through and navigate through that pain or through that darkness. And just like how we eventually find our way out of a dark room, we also eventually find a way out of our own darkness. Because the reality is, darkness doesn't last forever, and nor do our hard times or our dark times, because everything, and I mean everything in this life, is temporary. So just remember that your dark times are teaching you something. There's a lesson and a purpose behind all of it. And the reality is, we all may not often understand or know what that lesson is while we're going through it. But eventually, when the light comes out and the light is shining, you will see it. It will be revealed to you, and you will understand why you had to go through those things. And you will also see what you gained from them too. Everything, and I mean everything in this life, serves a divine and greater purpose for all of us. These dark, hard times are not excluded from that. They absolutely serve a purpose too. And it's just important to remember that when you're going through these moments, that there's something deeper and greater for you in all of this. Your soul truth moments are going to be some of the realest moments in your life. And they're typically not going to come in a pretty little package. In fact, it's going to come in all these things I just talked about, in pain, in hardship, in darkness, in adversity, in challenge. That's usually what your soul truth moments are wrapped up in. But as I said earlier, those dark times and hard times are sacred, and they were intentionally and divinely designed by God for you to go through in order for your soul and your entire being to be able to grow and expand in all the ways that it needs to and is meant to, so that you can also reach your highest potential. Your light is actually being cultivated in the darkness. And we all know that dark times don't last forever, like I said. We all know that eventually there's going to be that light at the end of the tunnel. And when that light finally shines, what you're seeing is your soul truth. What you're seeing is everything your soul just did to get you through it. What you're seeing is everything your soul learned and gained from this darkness. What you're seeing is a better and brighter version of you. And that bright, beautiful light that you finally see and feel after a dark and hard time in your life, not only is that light God and God's love for you and the universe's love for you, that light is also a reflection of you. Thank you for listening to The Soul Truth with Pauline Montemayor. I hope this sacred wisdom will continue to guide you along your path. We would love to hear from our listeners, so please show some love by leaving a review and a rating. Stay real, stay you, and stay blessed.